Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Although it is a bit chilly in the morning, but the spring is definitely with us now. But I wish I could say the same thing for the global economy. We are very fortunate this morning to have the best speaker who will tell us all about the global economy, what's happening in the global economy, and what will happen in the global economy. Particularly, he will tell us what's happening in major global economies. Before I say a few words about Dr. John Lipsky, before I forget, I just want to recognize some of the our guests this morning. We have National Assemblyman, who is a very busy man, but he is with us, the National Assemblyman, from Saenuri-dang, Kim Dong-hwan, and thank you very much for joining us. And also we have the Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade, and actually he has been working with me to work with Dr. John Lipsky in the course of preparing G20's Seoul Summit. And also we have Mr. Yu from Financial Service Commission, and Richard Dobbs joined us from McKinsey. He also worked with us in the preparation of G20 Business Summit at the time of the summit. And then we have ambassadors from Switzerland and Brazil and New Zealand. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm sorry I cannot recognize all other the guests. Well, John Lipsky is currently teaching at the Johns Hopkins, the Paul H. Nitz School of Advanced International Studies, what is known as the SIZE. As you know already, I'm sure well about him, John Lipsky served as first Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund for September 2006 to August 2011, which was the most critical period for the global economy and the IMF. He played such an important role, critical role, while he was there. I really enjoyed working with him in the course of preparing G20 summits. We worked very closely at the time of Seoul Summit and persuade our members to agree on the quota adjustment and everything else. Dr. John Lipsky, before he became the first Deputy Managing Director at the IMF, he worked in private sector in financial community at J.P. Morgan and Salomon Brothers, and as a vice president and chief economist. So he knows financial markets and private sector and economy and very well. And so he did so well at, I suppose, at the IMF. And also, of course, he spent almost a decade at the IMF before he worked for the private sector. And now he's teaching, and also he's very actively engaged in international the conferences and meetings like these, and he's on the board of directors of U.S. National Bureau of Economic Research, MBER, and where I'm sure he will advise the scholars there. And and particularly dealing with all this cyclical, the business cycle and so forth. Well, with this, I would like to invite Dr. John Lipsky to enlighten us. Please join me in welcoming.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for that very kind invitation. It's a great pleasure for me to be back in Seoul. As Dr. Sekong said, we had a wonderful opportunity to work very closely in the preparation of the Seoul summit, which I think accomplished a lot. We'll talk about that a little bit later, about what has happened to the G20 since Seoul, which is probably not as happy as it was then. But it's wonderful to come back in the run-up to the Seoul summit. I got to visit Korea many times, and the Korean authorities were very gracious and careful to make sure that we didn't just hold meetings in Seoul, but various places around the country. So we got to see all kinds of aspects of Korea, and I must say I enjoyed that very, very much. It was so bad that by the end I insisted on having kimchi at breakfast, and although I see we didn't have that this morning, but I will be sure and get plenty of kimchi today before I leave Korea. So I want to speak about a few themes this morning, and I certainly want to thank you all for coming here today so early on a chilly morning. I'm going to be using these slides. I won't lean too heavily on them because I don't know if you can see them so clearly in the back, but they will be, I'm sure they can be made available in electronic form or printed form before, or as you wish. So I want to talk a little bit about setting the stage for the global economy. There's a fair amount of uncertainty about the outlook, and for good reason. But I want to delve a little more deeply, but I'll try to keep it brief, on the outlook and what's happened in the United States or what's happening. Then perhaps I will talk a bit in some detail on my vision of what is happening in Europe, as that is, I would say, these are two very important questions in looking forward. Is the U.S. economy on the road to stronger growth? Is the European Union going to survive in its current form? And if so, will it eventually contribute to global growth? Then I want to turn to issues of China and Japan. I just am coming from Tokyo, where I participated in a conference that included some government officials and some advisors to the new government, and I'll talk just very briefly about the issues there as I see them. A few words about China, where there's a new government, as you know, has just recently taken over, and then a word or two about the G20, and then I'll try to get all that in a reasonably concise form, and then I hope we will have time for discussion, and so I can respond to the questions that you find are most important. Well, hopefully you can see my title. Regarding the global outlook, I'm going to claim that there are some grounds for optimism. And in fact, I think the grounds for optimism are probably stronger than is often recognized. But financial markets are doing better, so someone must be more optimistic, even if not all the experts and the commentators are. But there are some very significant risks that are still in front of us and will continue to concern the investors and officials for some time to come. So, what are the grounds for optimism? First, I'm going to explain to you why I think the most likely outcome in the U.S. is strengthening growth, and if anything, I would guess probably somewhat stronger than the current consensus forecasts although again, I'm not trying to say there are no risks. In Europe, the growth prospects this year and next year are not good, but it is my claim to you that the system is more resilient than it is generally given credit for, and I'll explain that. In China, certainly the downside risks seem to be fading. The worry of a significant slowdown in growth seemed to be in the past. And if I'm right about the U.S. economy, that will give greater confidence there. And in Japan, it's quite notable, and I suspect from your vantage point here so nearby, you understand that even better than we do halfway around the world, that the atmosphere and attitudes seem to be improving substantially. And there are probably some at least reasonable reasons for that to be occurring. At the same time, we certainly wouldn't want to claim that there are no risks. In the U.S., the combination of policies of a tightening of fiscal policy at a time of unprecedented accommodation by monetary policy, in the context in which the federal debt is continuing to grow as a percent of GDP, and therefore you have a combination of fiscal tightening but still growing debt to GDP ratios on the one hand, and on the other hand, the continuing force of unprecedented quantitative easing on the part of the Fed does worry some that we're going to potentially end up with an unpleasant combination in the U.S. of slowing growth and new worries about, and yet worries about inflation. I think those are wrong, but they can't be ignored. And in Europe, as we've seen, it's a virtual certainty that Europe is currently in a recession today as we speak, and there's little chance of a forceful turnaround anytime soon. And that, of course, creates risks about a loss of enthusiasm and willingness to do what is necessary to fix the economy and preserve the Eurozone at the same time. Again, I'm going to make a case, an optimistic case, but this can't be discarded. In China, some of the optimism reflects assumptions about the likelihood of policy reforms and at the same time a positive external outlook. If either of those were to be not the case, then the current comfort about the prospect of moderate to strong Chinese growth could change. And in Japan, new set of policies has been announced. The question we'll talk about a little later of exactly what will the content of those policies be and will they be effective. The risk, of course, is that the current optimism gives way to renewed pessimism if the policies either are less decisive than are hoped and do not have the effect that the authorities anticipate. What we see for global growth, however, this is a kind of a consensus figure for growth, suggesting that we ought to have about stable, just modestly stable, stronger growth this year with better prospects for 2014. If we use the figure for PPP weights, that's equivalent to the way the IMF measures it. Says about 3% last year, 3.1% this year. That's the same figure. 3.7% next year. That's notably better, but not that great. And some improvement in the developed economies and in emerging economies both. But here is global growth over the past 50 years. And you don't have to be a mathematician to see that here we are now 6 years after the crisis, and we're not even back to long-term trend growth. Not even back despite that big hole that we fell into. So this is hardly grounds for celebration. It's just a minimum. But, and here's signs, optimistic signs, when we look at manufacturing output, which suffered substantially in the downturn, which then strengthened and weakened again in the last 2 years, and this has been one of the sources of negative surprises for the global economy over the last 2 years, was the failure of the manufacturing sector to sustain strength in the post-crisis era. At least the last few readings, especially in the U.S., suggest at least a turn toward the better. And of course, we all know, looking at stock markets around the world, that they have registered optimism. At the very least, if you were a cynic and skeptical, you would say, of course, with the major central banks pumping so much cash into the system and holding interest rates so low, one of their unstated goals is to raise asset prices, and here you see it. That's the less happy view. A happier view was that this reflects forward-looking anticipation by investors of an improving outlook. But we all know in the developed economies, in the advanced economies, that there is a problem that has not been solved and is not getting better quickly, and that is the level of unemployment, which skyrocketed in the wake of the crisis and is improving only slowly. Here we can see that for the developed economies as a whole, we're still at a rate above that that prevailed for the last couple of decades, and it is not going to be solved quickly. And this is one of the unknowns, because certainly populations, voters, are not going to be particularly happy about this continuing high rates of unemployment. And yet, no authorities in the developed world have quick solutions for this problem. It's simply not going away. And as a result, because of weak overall growth, weak job growth, that has meant weak income growth, and weak income growth has meant weak consumption growth. That's something I know you felt here in Korea, as about engaging demands for your very highly successful export products. But here again, the latest data suggest a turn for the better in the U.S., in Japan, but not in Europe. The one aspect that is given comfort in some sense to authorities is the lack of inflation pressure globally. And here you can see both in the developed countries and emerging economies, inflation is at relatively acceptable levels and stable. And in fact, we'll talk about Japan, whether there's a prospect of them ending their deflation, which has proved to be, in many opinions, in my opinion, perhaps as troublesome and in some ways more troublesome than high inflation. But it's not a problem, as I say, in either the industrial or emerging economies, the developed or emerging economies at this point. So that means that from their vantage point, monetary authorities and others have degrees of freedom in their policies because there's little risk of the emergence of near-term inflation pressures. And that's interesting in a way. Energy prices are high. They haven't gone down. In fact, they've gone up a bit most recently. And yet that has not had the effect of creating new inflation fears. And it has not carried over in general to commodity prices, which remain well below their peaks of just a couple years ago. So again, this gives some comfort to authorities that inflation is not a near-term problem. And that's why monetary policy, both in the advanced and emerging economies, remains historically accommodative. And that's not going to change. Even in emerging markets, we can see that in general, short-term rates, in other words, monetary policy rates, are below inflation rates in general. So even in emerging economies that are doing much better than the advanced economies, there is strong monetary stimulus. The question, of course, is how long can that be sustained without eventually causing problems of inflation worries? And will central banks, who traditionally will come under pressure not to raise rates, even when economies begin to improve, will they be willing and able to take actions to preserve this low inflation, low interest rate environment? Well, bond investors remain optimistic, as you can see, and they must be considered, at least in part, a gauge regarding inflation worries. So you have, for the moment, a happy combination in markets, from this point of view, of equity prices rising, suggesting some optimism about the outlook, bond prices still at historic lows, suggesting investors still think that inflation is a very distant concern. Now let's talk about the U.S. and see why I've told you. I think the likelihood, if I had to guess, is that the outlook is more favorable than the consensus views. It seems to me that one aspect that is obvious about the U.S. economy has been the very substantial weakness, of course, in the housing sector. The housing sector was the epicenter of the downturn, with its involvement with the innovative or so-called toxic securities that helped spread the woes through the financial sector around the world. And here's the part that has puzzled me as to why it was allowed to continue, but also puzzled me why it wasn't less clear of how important this was. The U.S. house prices, here I have actual home sales. And what I'm showing you is there was a huge run-up, huge drop, and a very, very gradual recovery that is finally now producing output that is vaguely getting towards something as normal. What was so notable about this? The drop in house prices and in housing activity was first one of the causes, the critical cause of a decline in household net worth in the U.S. that, of course, raised the savings rate and limited consumption spending, and at the same time caused big unemployment, especially of people who are not necessarily high-skilled and may not have easy access to alternative employment. So this has been a kind of a vicious circle. Weakness in the housing sector has fed through the economy two ways, financially and directly in activity. And yet, in an economy that theoretically is a fairly market-oriented economy, house prices on average fell for 6 years. It took 6 years to clear the housing market. I actually think that was a failure of policy. A choice had to be made, either to let the market clear, and if policy action, government action was needed, it should be to support the homeowners who suffered grievous losses. That's one way to do it. In other words, let the market clear and adjust and help the people who got hurt, or support the market so people didn't get hurt. But neither was an easy choice. They were both very difficult choices politically and technically. And in the end, neither was done. And so in some ways, the market was interfered with and supported, but not enough to prevent the downturn. And on the other hand, not much effective support was offered to homeowners. Net result, 6 years of downdraft, finally having come to an end. Now that is, I think, one of the reasons why consumption's looking up, optimism in general and consumers is looking up, because net worth is increasing, both from equity prices and now from house prices. And now, 6 years later, I think we're back to something that looks more like a traditional cycle in the U.S. Non-residential investment is still lagging, but that's not a surprise. That typically happens. If my optimistic scenario is right, we're going to see stronger spending by corporations both in non-residential investment, and as you know, their profit margins, their cash holdings, and their leverage are all as favorable as they have ever been. In other words, corporations have all the fuel they need for stronger investment. Credit, which has been extremely weak, is rebounding smartly now, suggesting that the small and medium enterprise sector, which is still reliant in the U.S. on the banking sector, is doing better. And fiscal policy. Let me tell you my own views, because if you read the press, you will hear the conventional wisdom on U.S. Government is that it is completely frozen. Partisan conflict is as bad as it's ever been. They can't decide anything, and nothing is getting done. And we just had this semi-sequester, and that was a disaster. Let me give you an alternative view. What just happened? Well, it may have been messy, but there's been an agreement on policies that will put the U.S. deficit on a downward trajectory with only modest near-term drag. I'm trying to figure out why that's bad. Second, the taxes were raised on the top earners, but the Bush-era tax cuts were made permanent for 98% of taxpayers. What odds would you have given 2 years ago that the Obama administration would agree to make virtually all the Bush tax cuts permanent? Why, President Obama's first campaign was all about trying to reverse those evil tax cuts. And yet, that's just what happened. Third, the defense spending in the U.S. has increased dramatically over the past decade and a half, as you can imagine. The Republicans just agreed to a substantial 10-year cut in defense spending, and of a degree that is notable, but not overwhelming, the kind that it's hard to imagine that those kind of cuts can't be accommodated within, while still maintaining an effective defense forces. And well, that's a fraught topic, especially in this region, and I'm probably not the one to talk about it. But from this fiscal policy point of view, the Republicans just agreed to defense cuts. Fourth, everybody says, well, this across-the-board cuts, that was terrible. They should have, it's like they keep, in Washington it was called a meat cleaver approach. Well, to me, this was the hallmark that these politicians have never been through a downsizing before. You have here in Korea. I have. I've been through a downsizing in the public sector. I've been through a downsizing in the private sector. And guess what always happens? You always end up cutting across the board because it is too hard to say, you're okay and you're going to get it. You end up having to say, everybody's going to give. So when they say, oh, this is terrible, it's across the board, I say, of course it's across the board. It's how these things always happen. You work out the details later. Fifth, the administration has just agreed that entitlements, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, should be on the table for discussion. Both sides have agreed that tax reform should be on the table. Does this sound like paralysis? Now, the last two are very important and are going to be very, very difficult, but they don't have to get solved tomorrow. They're not today's problems. They're a long-term problem. And now both sides have said, yes, they're a problem and we have to get working. Again, not a pretty picture, but it seems to me that all this complaining about how terrible things are in Washington has just missed this point, which strikes me as important. Okay. Challenge, obviously, for monetary policy is going to be engineering an exit. Next Monday, I'm looking forward to a speech in New York by Bill Dudley, the president of the New York Fed. He's going to be in charge. His bank will be in charge, literally, of the operations that will engineer the exit. I'm looking forward to some discussion on his part of how they expect to do it. I won't waste your time with going into the details, but simply to say this is going to be interesting because the Fed's balance sheet is of a proportion, both in absolute size and relative to GDP, that has no precedent. Mr. Bernanke has said, it's not written in stone that we have to shrink the balance sheet. But if they don't shrink the balance sheet and leave that big balance sheet as the economy recovers, inevitably that means the Fed will be paying huge amounts of interest payments to financial institutions instead of paying profits to the Treasury. This will be interesting. Now let's turn to Europe. Here's the, I think, a particularly challenging issue, of course. And here my point is there are no easy answers. But here are some, I think, introductory points that I believe are important in thinking about what's going on there. First of all, the EU isn't a country. It doesn't intend to become the United States of Europe. It's something else. The analogy shouldn't work. If you're interested, I suggest you go and read the preamble to the Lisbon Treaty, that is the Constitution of the EU, and then read the preamble to the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution is about, that preamble's about that long. It says, we the people are to form a more perfect union to, I should be able to quote it, but I will embarrass myself and I won't even try. Read the Lisbon Treaty. It says, the member states agree, in essence, to cooperate in those areas where we have common objectives. It doesn't sound like a constitution of a country. It's something else. So you have to look and see where are the things that there is agreement. And in terms of economic and financial policy, number one is to create an internal market free of barriers. Secondly, how to do that? By creating a single currency for the Union. Why did they create the single currency? The single currency was created because enough people in Europe believed that it was necessary to sustain a single market. And they had concluded that in a world inspired in the 60s and 70s by the growth and success of the U.S. economy, then more recently the growth of Asian economies, the notion is, as a series of relatively small, more isolated economies, they don't stand a chance of success, and they need a single market to gain the advantage of economies of scale that will allow them to be effective at a global level. And I think that is still accepted even by the voters and the populace, by the people of the European Union. It was always controversial to claim that you need a single currency to sustain a single market. But the point is, enough of them believed it that they did it. And if you, in 1992, believed that you had to have a single currency for a single market, what would you think today? Would you think that it is possible to unravel the single currency without threatening the single market? I don't think so. I think you can make a much better case today that allowing the single currency to fail threatens the stability of the single market. And as a result, this, to my mind, is why why outsiders keep getting surprised at the actions that the Europeans are willing to take to preserve the single currency. To my mind, there is a political element, but more than anything, it's about the single market. But, and I should hurry up, right, so I don't make this too long, but it seems to me that the challenges of the single currency that people say, oh, it was a silly idea, all those challenges the Europeans understood them. that the Eurozone was not what we call an optimal currency area. They knew that. The goal was to make it an optimal currency area. They don't have to be completely the same. Michigan is different from Mississippi, is different from Massachusetts, but they have to be more the same. And the idea is the single currency would force that integration. That there were no federal fiscal institutions to provide transfers to help ameliorate strains across the union, or that they had a single financial market without a single financial regulator. These were problems that were understood. Why they did it at the outset was because there was no agreement about what the institutions, the European institutions, would look like in the long run. The idea was as the challenges emerged, they would make the institutions to meet the challenges. What they didn't expect was that the challenge would come from the mother of all financial crises, coming from the United States. They simply had not foreseen the degree of challenge that they are facing. Okay. What is the basic problem? The basic underlying economic problem in Europe is the loss of competitiveness within the Eurozone of the weaker countries, of the crisis countries. In economic terms, because their unit labor costs grew rapidly relative to that of the core countries. Parenthetically, when the euro was founded, it was the conventional wisdom that the big winners were going to be Spain and Italy, and the big loser was going to be Germany. Today, everybody tells you as if it is revealed truth that Germany was inevitably going to be the big winner. I can tell you 20 years ago, that's not what anybody thought. But has there been some improvement? Has there been any progress? Take a look. That shows you on the bottom unit labor costs in Germany over the past decade, and on the top in the crisis countries. Is it all solved? No. Is progress occurring? Yes. How about on fiscal imbalances? On the left, you can see what's happening in the crisis countries and in Germany, and that shows you that there's been a substantial reduction in the fiscal imbalances, painful as it has been. But what about the fiscal balance in the Eurozone? It's probably hard to see, but that shows you the U.S., the UK, Japan, and the Eurozone, what's happened to their deficits. And I can tell you, if you can't see, the one with the smallest deficit, that's the Eurozone. Overall, the Eurozone does not have a fiscal problem. Lower debt and lower deficits than the others. It's the distribution of those. So to say this is a problem that can't be handled or is insurmountable can't be true. And here are current account imbalances are being reduced as well. So the point here is there's real progress going on in Europe in addressing their problems. Where is their problem? Nowhere is the issue of unemployment worse than in the Eurozone. They've got to find a way to restore growth. But the ECB has been successful, at least for now, in calming markets. You can see there are three big interventions back in 2011, where they started buying the debts of Spain and Italy. In the end of 2011, where they instituted the long-term repurchase operations, the LTROs, and last summer when Mario Draghi said we're going to do whatever it takes. Can they keep it calm? Well, we'll see. Notice the press has been very excited about Cyprus. Markets have been less excited. They don't think it's not, you can't even call it the tail wagging the dog. Cyprus is the hair on the tail of the dog. But a solution has to be found for Cyprus. I think it will be. Second, and the trickiest, how to restore growth. Most of the work on restoring growth has got to come from the improvement in on the one hand, internal efficiency. That unit labor cost chart I showed you has to continue to improve. And the countries, the weak economies of the zone, have got to institute the structural reforms that are necessary to improve their productivity. In the meantime, the ECB has to succeed in sustaining market stability, financial market stability, and they have to make the agreement on creating a single supervisory mechanism in the Eurozone a success. They have agreed on substantial new initiatives in terms of fiscal integration that have to be implemented. And there's one big challenge for the long term, and that is, I can tell you, I was based in London during the negotiations of the Maastricht Treaty in the early 90s. I can assure you it was never the intention of the architects of Maastricht to create a situation in which the UK could be permanently inside the single market and permanently outside the single currency. The solution has to come, and as you know, Prime Minister Cameron has agreed with that as well. There has to be a decision. So what are the three questions here? The critical questions: is the single market and the single currency, will it survive? Will it expand? Why I say that is because today there are 27 members of the European Union and 17 of them are in the Eurozone. If it survives, it will expand. The goal, the Constitution, the Lisbon Treaty says that the Eurozone, the Union has a single market and a single currency. Will it thrive? What are my answers? Yes, as you can see, I think it will survive. If it survives, I think it's very likely that it will expand. Will it thrive? Hopefully. But I showed you there are big hurdles to be covered. Now let me turn to this region very briefly, and I do this very humbly. I'm sure you could all give me a lecture on how things are going here and in the region. But I can tell you, and it's no surprise, that the continued strength of Asian economy is absolutely a bedrock for restoring global growth. Everybody recognizes that. The contribution Asia has made is fundamental. But it's also the case, as you all recognize, that many of the key countries, maybe some of the very, very, very largest countries of the region, rebalancing is going to be required for continued success. And this requires policy changes that may not be so easy. Perhaps China could be discussed in that context. New government, will it bring new policies? I could put this simply. Here are the key issues. Read perhaps all of you already are familiar with the 12 five-year plan of China. It's a document for thoroughgoing reform. My guess is if you look down every single element of that 12 five-year plan, you would say, yes, 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 this is good. And then you would remember, if you pulled up the 11th five-year plan, that most of those good things were in the 11th five-year plan and weren't done. So will they be done or not? Are they going to take the kind of actions, policy actions needed to rebalance the economy towards stronger domestic demand, especially stronger consumption, more effective allocation of resources, better, more efficient use of public spending? Counter argument is, well, they haven't done so badly, have they? And I think the answer is absolutely not. But, and the but is, in my mind, that, of course, one of the important elements of China's success has been willing to provide no negative or no real returns to small savers who have been basically forced to hold bank savings that pay nothing, that allows banks who receive the funds for nothing to loan them out for low rates to investments that might not be that useful. State enterprises that receive the savings of the people and produce profits that they then keep to themselves instead of giving back to the owners, to the people. These are all reforms. I'm not saying anything that's not all recognized. All of this is in the 12 five-year plan. Will it happen? Will it happen? And to my mind, a critical element is what are they going to do about financial sector reform? Why? Because what you've seen now is people aren't stupid. They've noticed, as they become more sophisticated, that putting money in a bank and receiving very, very low interest that doesn't even match inflation, and watch that bank make loans that you don't know whether they're going to get paid back or not, may not be the most brilliant thing to do. And so you're seeing the growth of a shadow banking system in China that is unregulated that is headed for trouble. So I think it's clear a decision needs to be made, and let's see if the new government makes it. Japan, where I come from, yesterday, you know about Abe-san, the Prime Minister, and his 3 arrows. Actually, when you hear the 3 arrows, you realize it's pretty much straightforward. Monetary policy, fiscal policy, and structural policy. So those 3 arrows are not uniquely Japanese, but they seem to be the right ones. What's the idea? Well, one of the aspects that is going to start within days, most likely, April 4th, I think, is the next monetary policy meeting. Kuroda-san, the new governor, is now in office. And the only question is, are they going to wait till the first scheduled meeting to make some changes? Maybe they'll act sooner. Excuse me. But what are these changes? They're very simple. There are 3 questions, or 3 aspects, as I call it: bigger, longer, wider, bigger purchase, bigger quantitative easing, longer, meaning longer duration, purchase of longer duration instruments. So far they've limited to only 3 years. No wonder it hasn't had much impact. And wider, meaning accepting a still wider range of instruments. It's interesting. It's not completely obvious that these policies are going to have much success. So it's going to be very, very interesting. What is, to my mind, is critical is that the Bank of Japan has said, and I think this is what he will say. I guess Kuroda-san, I believe, had a press conference yesterday, but to be honest, I haven't seen the reports. But I'm fairly confident what he said, I'm sure he said, and if he didn't, he should have said, is the Bank of Japan will accept responsibility for ending deflation in this country and mean it. And that doesn't mean he's going to succeed. But I think heretofore there hasn't been a sense of we'll do whatever it takes to end deflation. And there's probably been too much fatalism by the bank on this score, because if the central bank can't control nominal levels in the economy, you almost ask, what is it for? Why do you have a central bank? That's what it's there for. They've got to find a way to do it. Fiscal policy. They've announced stimulus. The question is this typical Japanese stimulus where they announce a big number and at the end of the day when folks look back, the effective amount is smaller and some of it is not so effective anyway? Not yet clear. We just need to see greater details. On the basis of what's been announced already, conventional wisdom is that perhaps 0.5% of GDP stimulus is involved, not the bigger numbers that the government has announced, but I'm not telling you that as a certainty. Nonetheless, it's going to have a positive impact. And with regard to deflation, sorry, I should have mentioned this, thanks to the decisions of the previous government, of the administration of Prime Minister Noda, which took the rather brave and not popular steps of announcing and beginning the implementation of a longer-term process of increasing taxes to make a dent in the huge deficit and debt of the Japanese authorities. Next year, administered price rises and tax increases are going to add about 1.5% to the price level. That's not really inflation, but measured inflation is going to be up next year. So positively for the Japanese economy, the stimulus is going to do something positive, and the deflation is going to go away, at least for a while. Whether it stays is the critical question, and here structural reforms hold the key. And that's why, as you know, I'm sure you saw here, the Prime Minister Abe has announced that they will join the TPP negotiations. Obviously an issue of great importance in this country as well as in China. This has the possibility of being transformational, but like all trade negotiations, it also has the possibility of being nothing at all, of going on and on and on. You all remember Doha? Well, Most people have forgotten. But let's see if this turns into something or nothing. What is amazing to me, forgive this detail, everyone can remember the name of the last highly successful Japanese politician, Koizumi-san. Koizumi-san won tremendous popular support and won an overwhelming re-election in which his only issue was the privatization of the postal savings system. And his successor, I believe it was a fellow named Abe, who turned his back on that program. Now let's see if the second term of Prime Minister Abe will bring some progress on an area that previously most successful politician thought was crucial to making credible structural reform in Japan. What I heard yesterday in Tokyo was the answer is yes, that this time around there's going to be some deeper structural reform, including in the form of privatization of the postal system. Final topic, and you've been very patient. What in the world happened to the G20 after Seoul and after the success of my colleagues here in organizing a summit that was beautifully organized in practical detail, everything thought through, everything operating like clockwork, most impressive, but also some important things were accomplished. The G20 has 3 agenda items: macroeconomic policy cooperation, financial sector reform, and international financial institution reform. Seoul was the site of important agreements on all 3 areas. You may remember the Seoul Action Plan within the framework for strong, sustainable, and balanced growth in the mutual assessment process. You may remember the endorsement here of the Basel III capital accords. You may remember the agreement in Seoul on the new quota arrangements in the fund, and the promise of the heads of state to deliver ratification of that Seoul agreement by October 2012. Well, subsequently, we had the Cannes summit. You probably, you may have noticed, because it was all about Europe and not much about this. Did you notice the Los Cabos summit? Maybe not. There's one coming up in St. Petersburg this year. Have you heard a lot about it? Well, this is the principal institutional innovation in the post-crisis era. 25 or so heads of state and heads of government get together on an annual basis to discuss their responsibilities that they have claimed for themselves of being the premier venue for discussion and decision on issues of financial and economic policy. If that process were to be left moribund, I think it would be a very sad commentary. I don't have magic answers. What I can tell you is, contrary to what you see in the public eye, substantial work is going on in all of those areas. But what has been missing is the sense of political consensus and political commitment. And now it's time for leadership. Is there positive potential? I think so. I think we can see some growing confidence in broad improvements in the global economy. And I think that the prospect of a restoration of the G20 consensus and cooperation is not mission impossible, even though I don't hold out great hopes for this year. But next year, my hope is that remember all the way back where I started, that the global economy should look notably better by 2014. My hope is that in that environment actually will be very conducive for new policy action, new policy cooperation, and a new consensus. Sure, there are risks: stalling growth, ineffective policies, loss of confidence. But I don't think that that's necessary or even likely. Thank you very much. Could have been like at the Oscars.
Yeah.
Yes, the actors fell down.
Well, thank you very much for very, very well-structured, illuminating the overview of the global economy, and particularly major global players, major economies. Fortunately, the bottom line is that the spring is coming, maybe very slowly. So I'm very glad to have this rather cautious, optimistic views regarding the global economy. With this very excellent presentation, now let me invite any questions or comments from the floor. It's a very rare opportunity to have Dr. Lipsky here, so please, yes, Dr. Kim and the Minister An.
If I could say, I'm very happy to take any questions on any topic, not just on what I spoke about. Anything.
Yes. Okay. Dr. Kim is president of Korea Economic Association. Is a professor at the Seongyang University.
Thank you, Dr. Lipsky, for your excellent presentation. I have two short questions about central bank governors. Question one: will Mr. Bernanke be ready or is always willing to implement fourth or even the fifth round of QE? And second question, how do you compare two Japanese governors, new Kuroda and his predecessor Shirakawa, in terms of their policy philosophy?
Yeah, some more questions. Okay. Yes. Vice Minister An, please.
John, of course, it's so nice to see you in Seoul. And then I'm listening to you, and then I cannot but be reminded of all those meetings of the G20 Sherpas. I had the pleasure of observing the G20 process as a Sherpa. And then each meeting of the Sherpa, of course, it was started with your tour d'horizon of the global economic situation. And then I have to tell you, it was such a pleasure to be coming those meetings. Why? Because I knew it would be an opportunity to listen to you, to make that the tour d'horizon of the global economy. And then I'm very glad this morning that a larger number of Korean audience have this opportunity to listen to you. And then it was superb.
Thank you.
I mean, it was done within 30 minutes, and then it's the best summary of a global economy, which can be done in 30 minutes. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
One comment and then two questions. My one comment is, well, with respect to the G20's role, then we should remember next year, 2014, the G20 presidency would be Australia. And Australians are as enthusiastic about G20 as we are in Korea. And then you just mentioned about global economy improving in 2014. So let's hope for the best for the global economy as well as for the G20 process for next year. That's my comment. And then my two questions. First comment is with respect to what you said about a fiscal situation in Washington, D.C. And you, in fact, shared with us many of the points why you think things are better than it is being described in the U.S. press. And then one of the things you mentioned was Republicans agreed to defense cutting. I was puzzled. Did the Republicans agree, or was it because of the sequestration? So that is my first question. My second question is, well, you just mentioned about Abenomics. And then you just said that, well, it's a usual package of three things: fiscal policy, monetary policy, and then structural reform. There is nothing magical about it. And then for the time being, it seems to be working very, very well. So this question cannot but come up in my mind, which is that if it is usual, if it is working so well, why his predecessors didn't do the same thing? I mean, why Mr. Noda couldn't do it, right? And then another related point would be this, which is that, of course, we do not know the long-term or the mid-term prospect of Abenomics. But at the same time, I think I agree with you when you say that the key would be in the structural reform. There is so much which can be done by fiscal policy and monetary policy, so the real key would be in the structural reform. And then with respect to the structural reform, you just mentioned about TPP, you just mentioned about privatization of postal services. But other than that, and then with respect to TPP, even if I have strong trade background, I tend to agree with you with respect to the TPP. It could be something or it could be nothing. So other than TPP and then privatization of postal service, what in your mind would be the meaningful and then effective structural reforms which Prime Minister Abe could, introduce? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, okay. Richard Dobbs, and then we'll...
It was a fascinating view and a lot of very interesting perspectives on the global economy. You touched a little bit on political risk, but I think political risk could be bigger. I mean, we talked, Vice Minister Ahn talks about structural reforms. Remember, the person who did the big structural reforms, everyone lauds for this, was Schroeder in Germany, who wasn't re-elected. We look at the structural risks, political risks that are happening in Italy at the moment with the sending in the clowns, as the economists rightly put it. Is there a risk that we're going to have a political eruption somehow derail the global economy?
Okay. Thank you. Very good questions. So let me just take them in order. Mr. Bernanke, is he committed to do whatever it takes on quantitative easing? I think it's a very good question. I, of course, wonder about it myself, but I take as a text the speech he made that you may be familiar with, the speech he made last year at Jackson Hole. And if you go back and look at that, what is surprising is what he has said, and it's reasonable, of course, and he ought to say it, is that they are not engaging in these quantitative easing policies blindly, that they understand it's a balance of costs and benefits. In other words, remember, holding short-term interest rates or holding interest rates exceptionally low is financial repression. And financial repression is a choice to favor borrowers over savers. And savers are receiving very low rates of return. So it's not just wonderful. But he claimed in that speech that QE had been very effective. In fact, he says that GDP was 2% higher than it would have been without the QE. I think that is a figure that is quite controversial. I don't know if many others would agree that it has been that powerful. But the point is, a little bit like my point about people who believe that the euro was necessary for the single market. If you believe it, you act on your beliefs. And if he really believes, which he seems to, he says it in public, that QE has been in fact, very powerful and positive, then there's no reason to go ahead. Just because other people don't believe it might it could influence your decision, but if you believe it's powerful, then you'll do it. So I think that's likely to be true. Japan, the difference in the two governors. Well, first, we don't really know for sure what Kuroda-san is going to do, and Kuroda-san has no background in monetary policy, and I don't mean that as a criticism. I've known him for many years, as I'm sure many of us in the room do, and have very high respect. You must know him very well as his service, both as vice minister and also as head of the ADB. But he's made very clear his willingness to accept more direct responsibility for ending the deflation. Governor Shirakawa, who I have the highest respect for in every way, shape, and form, I would say that he was particularly concerned about long-term implications and impacts, and probably he's intellectually extremely honest. And in his view, that the short-term deflation was in large degree structural and could not be overcome in the short run without creating some dangerous distortions in the economy. And therefore, I think he did what he did, not because he thought there was nothing else he could do, but I think his view of the costs and benefit were different. None of these are eternal truths. I think, frankly, if I were Kuroda-san in his shoes, I would be doing what he's doing. I think it's very, it's important for the authorities, for example, the monetary authorities who have are the only people who have responsibility, only institution with responsibility for affecting the price level. It's not, they shouldn't be in a situation of saying there's nothing we can do. So, I would say Shirakawa-san, his view was a much longer term one, and a responsible one. Kuroda-san, I think, agrees with the notion that even though that may be true, it is necessary to run some risks in the short run because they see the cost-benefit balance as different. U.S. Fiscal and what I said about the sequestration, and the point was the following. This is my own political judgment, and I'm no politician and no expert. So this is an amateur view. And the amateur view is there's not a chance in the world that the Republican Party could come out in favor on a standalone basis of significant defense spending cuts. Just doesn't work. Because there are too many people in their camp who think that there shouldn't be any at all. I think there are folks who say we should be spending more. Even though I think it's a reasonable judgment that there's a need to control spending, and it's hard to believe that you can't. Any of you, I think many in this room have run large organizations and understand if you can't cut 5 or 10% out of your costs at any given time without giving up your essential mission, then you have a pretty exceptional circumstance. I think there's any organization, you can find some savings if you're forced to. But what happened was, in the context of the sequestration, that decision, namely, we acquiesce in a long-term program a 10-year program of defense reductions. It got hidden in the whole sequestration process. So that's why I say this is very good, because on a standalone basis, they just could never have supported it. I hope that's responsive. The Abenomics. First of all, why not? Why didn't all this happen under Noda-san? Noda-san was a very courageous fellow. And again, I'm not a good political judge, but he. I know him well enough that he felt someone had to bite the bullet in the Japanese political life and acknowledge that there was going to have to be long-term adjustment in their revenue situation. They couldn't go on running these giant deficits, and someone had to take the decision, and he did it, and it cost him. And I think I can tell you, far as I know, again, I don't want to overstate my knowledge or expertise, but my understanding was, I thought pretty clearly he understood that could be the outcome, that he could end up sacrificing his political career. But I think he felt strongly someone had to make the decisions. So I would say, for better or for worse, of course, the external circumstances turned out to be more difficult in many ways than he expected. In some ways, he was unlucky. But my guess is there is nothing that is being done today that Noda-san wouldn't have done if he were in office. So it was, the opportunity presented itself. The new, well, I don't have to go into it. I'm sure former Deputy Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs knows this much better than I do of how things work in government. Of sometimes you can get things done and sometimes you can't get things done, and it's not just because of what you want to do. But let's see how much structural stuff actually can get done. That's because none of that's easy. Like you imply, if it was easy, it would have already happened. The question was, okay, TPP, maybe yes, maybe something, maybe not something. Privatization, let's see what can actually get done. There always are vested interests against any privatization. The arguments are always well known. It's not easy. What else could they do? Well, here's an important part of something that could happen in Japan. female labor force participation is extremely low in Japan. Extremely low. It's a little puzzling. And
higher than Korea, though.
well, I'm not gonna comment on that, other than I have this is not a joke, in the context of my visits here with regard to the G20 summit, I met several young Korean women who were extremely impressive, whose vision was global, whose goal was to be an entrepreneur in technical area. We met some spectacular young ladies, and it seemed to me that I'll bet going forward that there are changes coming that will produce higher labor force participation here as well. But it would make a big difference. Political risk. You made reference to Chancellor Schroeder. All I can say is I had back in that era, I had the honor of having being part of a group that consulted with Finance Minister Eichel at the time, and Minister Eichel would say, in Germany, no shock treatment in Germany. And I said, well, that's nice, but here's what you're doing. Because you're doing it a little at a time, nobody is going to give you any credit because they don't, it's not a big announcement. It's all happening so quietly. So nobody's going to think you've done anything. And what you're really doing is you're going to make life much easier for your successor, because your successor is going to come in and all the reforms are going to be done and they're going to get the credit, because then things are going to get better. And that's just what happened. So if you want to get credit, you stand up and say, this is what I'm doing, right? Italy. How to interpret what's going on there is a good question. And but here's one thing that is often overlooked. The growth and productivity performance of Italy has been very, very weak. They have the weakness of a very high fiscal debt. They have the strongest budgetary situation in Europe. They have almost a 3% of GDP primary surplus. During the crisis, the finance minister, Giulio Tremonti, was adamant that the one thing that Italy just didn't have any degrees of freedom on the fiscal side, and if they didn't stick to discipline, that they were going to put themselves at great risk. So you can say, in a way, they in the end sacrificed their popularity. But Italy is actually not in near-term danger. Now, what was that vote? I think that vote that just occurred was a vote that said, we just don't have confidence in the existing parties. Does that mean that there will not appear a figure able to do this, to do what needs to be done to restore Italy to a stronger economic position? I frankly don't know. If you take a look at I saw a YouTube of Mr. Grillo's one of his performances, and I think it's kind of like that. It's a performance. It's hard to imagine that that's a fellow who is going to end up running a government. With all due respect, not everybody's made up to be a prime minister, but it's interesting to note. So the voters have said, we don't like the existing parties. We're expressing that in a protest vote. Let's see where that turns out, because, excuse me, you're probably aware, a poll recently was taken asking Italians, did they want Italy to stay in the euro? And it received 80% positive support. They want to stay in. So if you want to stay in, again, it's like, if you think the single market is critical for your success, then you're going to do what has to be done. And when people say, well, they can't take it anymore. I say, well, what does that mean? Right? What does that mean? You can't take it anymore. Well, if you're not going to take it, you must have a better alternative. And if you don't see a better alternative, then you're going to have to take it. Korea went through some pretty tough times back in the late 90s, and came out the other side. And why? Because when you saw that there was no better alternative, you did what had to be done. So I'm not saying it couldn't go wrong. Could go wrong. People could decide they didn't like the single market or it wasn't worth the price. But I don't think there's good evidence of that. I think the evidence is to the contrary. What has happened, my easy interpretation in Italy and in general in places like Spain, the Europeans have suffered from what I call it not the Lisbon Treaty, but the Lisbon Agenda fallacy. The Lisbon Agenda was a reform agenda promulgated in there around 2000 that said by 2010 the Eurozone was going to be the most productive economy in the world through a series of structural reforms. Didn't happen. Why? Well, their view was structural reform begins with legislation and regulation. Begins that way. I think in most countries in the world, I don't know so well about Korea, it's the other way around. Market forces affect companies. That forces them to deal with their workers, and where the legislation and regulation causes problems, then you go jointly to your legislatures and say, you've got to change the law because it's killing us. And then the law gets changed. It doesn't start with the legislator coming to the companies and say, I've got a wonderful idea of how to make your life better. So what has happened in Europe is because of especially the rigidities in their labor markets, it has taken a huge crisis and this huge run-up in unemployment to be able for folks to say, you know, we got to do things differently. This isn't working. And hopefully that's the hopeful sign that the result is going to be improvement and better performance, because for sure, if I'm right, U.S. is going to do better than most think. Could be wrong. That Japan, at least for now, for the next year, is going to seem to be doing better. Looks like China has overcome the worries about a big slowdown, and Asia is going to be okay. If you could start to think, not that everything's going to be wonderful in Europe, but that they're on a road that is going to be, that's going to relatively reliably produce improvements, then we have a much, much better place. And if that is accompanied by success, by the way, in financial sector reform, then we have something that starts to look sustainable.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, 2 questions and then we'll close. Yes, Mr. Speckman. Mr. Speckman used to head Prudential in Asia. And then just
Thank you for your presentation, which I enjoyed very much. On the U.S. front, what's your assessment of a so-called the grand bargain taking place? If not, what's going to be the next step? Thank you.
Okay. Then Mr. Baxing.
Thank you very much for your enlightening presentation. I have a question on Japan. Now Japan has declared they will print and pump the money to the market unlimitedly, targeting inflation at 2%, which means theoretically that if inflation goes 2%, interest rates should go near or exceed 2%. Other problem they have is their government debt is exceeding 230%, the highest in the world, and which means theoretically that means the government has to pay 4.26% of GDP for interest only. And now the market considers Japanese yen as a kind of sacred heaven currency. And once that they are approaching 2% inflation and interest rate goes up, then the market may start to suspect about the sacred heaven status. Then that could be disaster. Am I too pessimistic? Thank you.
I hope so. Grand bargain in the U.S. not going to happen soon, not at all. That's why this whole sequester process is why I think it's better than it looks. Remember, it was first there was the agreement on taxes, and now the so-called sequester on spending. What I tried to show is that when you step back from it, it isn't so bad. Is there more needed, a new bargain needed? Absolutely. Especially in the medium term on entitlement programs. And ultimately, there's going to have to be a societal decision about what is the right level of federal spending and what is the right level of federal revenues. Right now, I would say the name of the game in Washington, again, this is from a political amateur, the name of the game in Washington is the 2014 congressional elections, because the administration hopes, I'm sure, that some way, somehow, they can take back control, the Democrats can take back control of the House, and then they would have a free hand to do things the way they wanted. And of course, the Republicans want to do the opposite. So I would say, don't expect any bargains, grand or otherwise, at this point until after the 2014 election. Everybody in Washington is making a big deal about the prospect of immigration reform to show that they really can get along and do things. It's actually because both of them feel that they need that for the 2014 election. Not better than that. We may not get a grand bargain until the next presidential election, and maybe not even then. But the truth is, it's not the real challenge is the entitlement program in the U.S., especially Medicare, Medicaid, and you've got about two more, hopefully, about two more presidential terms before that becomes really, really crucial. Japan, you're absolutely. They have a huge government debt. Of course, that's gross debt. The net debt is smaller than that, but it's still the largest of any of the any developed country. It's not quite in where Zimbabwe got, but it's pretty bad. And like you say, they have benefited from very low interest rates. It's also true that very, very little of their debt is held, their government debt is held abroad, almost none. I think for the reasons that you say. So when you say it's a safe haven, I say, well, kind of, sort of, not really. Not the way the U.S. Treasury market is a safe haven, right? And I actually thought you were going to ask a slightly different question, which is, if there's a run-up of long-term interest rates, and that affects the JGB market, who holds a ton of those JGBs? And it's the financial sector holds them. And what happens to banks, to Japanese banks, when they suffer big capital losses on their principal holding? And that's, I think, a challenge. Allegedly, the big banks are okay, but maybe not everybody's okay. So there's, this is not going to be, it's not going to be costless, and it will require some careful management. So could things go wrong? Yeah. But big picture, deflation has been very pernicious for that economy. Overcoming inflation in a healthy way by restoring stronger growth in that economy will also have its good side effects in terms of willingness of people to hold property or to hold securities. If I were, this is right, presumptuous way to say it. If I were the new prime minister, I would be saying we are going to institute reforms that are going to make Japan a better place for investment, and it's first and foremost a better place for Japanese savers to invest. But if we make this a good place for Japanese to invest, foreigners will come too, and that'll be good.
Mm-hmm. Good. Okay, Dr. Yoon Chang-yeon wants to ask a question. Okay, okay. Then
thank
two
you
more
for
questions.
A great presentation. And I just waited others to ask the questions, but nobody asked this question, so it's my turn. So you talked about U.S. and Japan and Europe and China, but you didn't mention anything about Korea. And you just assumed that we know well about Korean economy, but I don't think we know well about Korean economy as you think. So so new government is starting and lots of agendas in Korea. So maybe you can give us good comments or advice to Korean economy.
Okay. Yes. One more. Yes.
Yes, I was going to ask you the same question on the Korean economy. Perhaps your advice as we have a new government coming in. You pointed out the problems the European economies are facing. especially with the high wage and the loss of competitiveness and then the rigid labor market, coupled with huge social programs created fiscal trouble. Many economists in this country, including myself, have concerns over this very similar pattern of trend, the Korean economy moving towards that direction. We have a very strong union here, rapid wage increase, moving into high-income countries too fast, huge rapid increase in social welfare programs, which will bring in, no doubt, fiscal problems in the future, and all of that very similar pattern. So how would you recommend to the Korean government on this? Let me stop there.
Okay. Here I thought I was going to get away with this. It wasn't by accident that I didn't mention Korea. In part, it's my own sense of humility here. I think you could all be giving me lectures about Korea and what is needed that would be more insightful than anything I can say. And in fact, one of the things I'm hopeful that will be one of the byproducts of my visit of a better view from about what you and your colleagues and cohorts think, what you expect the new government to be doing. Of course, frankly, in America and elsewhere, what has elicited the near-term concern is political, of course, and security issues that have been, I must say, from a distance, I just can't make any sense out of. I can't understand what's going on. I just don't. I really don't. It sounds dangerous. It looks dangerous, but I really don't think I understand. But the rest of the world worries about that, and whether it affects the economy here, I don't know. What is going to affect the economy? In many ways, Korea's had obviously faced some difficult times, but also had some pretty big successes. Very, very impressive how much success Korean exports have had in many key markets, electronics and autos, etc. It's quite a testimony. I got to say, I always tell people abroad, if you're talking about economic miracles, it's here. This is it. The strides that this country's made over the past decades is astonishing. But I think the points that you made are worth thinking about. The degree of labor market rigidities here to an outsider seem very daunting, without feeling like you have a lot of insight as to what exactly drives things, how things work here, because they do work. But there are some challenges coming up. The yen just appreciated by a very substantial amount, and that is going to, I'm sure, have some impact if it's sustained, and it looks like it's going to be sustained. Parenthetically, I should have said something. I meant to say this. One of the reasons that you haven't had any complaints on the part of Japanese partners about this decline in the yen is because there was a general consensus that the yen was overvalued. In other words, if it had been a situation in which everyone thought the yen was fair valued and it has fallen 20% from fair value, the situation would be very different. But there's a sense that it went from overvalued to now in the 90s we're talking about something that's reasonable. For sure, there won't be any tolerance. Yeah, nothing's for sure. But I can't imagine there will be any tolerance for policies on the part of the new authorities that are intended to further depreciate the currency. I would be surprised if that's going to happen. But it has happened. Secondly, of course, is going to be the impact of what happens in China. Will they, be successful in sustaining relatively solid growth? And are they really going to make the kind of changes, structural changes they say they are? So, I'm getting away with not being very specific about what needs to be done here. Partly because I don't, in all humility, I don't have any magic answers here. But, I would say that, the competitive environment is probably going to get in some ways better if I'm right about global growth, but more difficult if I'm right about what's likely to happen, for example, in Japan, China, and the potential role, as we talked about already, of the TPP. Whether if that's something, then Korea is going to have to deal with that. It's going to have implications for Korea. So these are big decisions coming up, but right now it's a little hard to see exactly what the exact environment's going to be. But inevitably a more flexible policy, more flexible economy is going to be interesting. But just one final remark, and I'll say, I wasn't joking about what I said about the young ladies I met here. Here's maybe this is just a vignette, and it's always sad to use ad hominem arguments, but still, I met a young lady who was on her way to she'd finished her degree here, was going to be studying abroad for a couple of years. Why? Because she was going someplace she thought they were the best at teaching how to do large systems integrations. And that she was going to do that for a couple of years and then study in the States. And another goal. And then was she going to come back and work for a big company here? She was going to come back here and start a company. And I thought this sounds like somebody in Silicon Valley. This didn't sound like your traditional. This is it's a woman, and B, saying none of those big companies for me. No. I'm going to start my own. Is this a one-off of which there's one in Korea and I happen to meet her? Or is this what the young generation thinks, that we're going to do things differently? If they are, this is going to be quite a place. So I'll stop there.
Well, yes. Actually, I just said that Korean female labor market participation is even lower than Japan, which is true. But as you just said, I won't be surprised to see Korean female labor participation rate go up much faster. And we already have a female president, and things happening here much faster than in some other countries. And that is another great the potential for increasing our growth, the economic growth potential. In fact, the Leipzig and some Korean economists did a study. And I recall a couple of years ago, in fact, of course, with many assumptions, if we increase female labor market participation to maybe around OECD average or something like that, then the economic growth potential may be enhanced almost to 1.5 percentage point or something like that, which is very, very high. So, but fortunately, we have many female representation here, and I hope this will happen faster. And well, with this, we can go on, and actually, a few already press interviews are scheduled for Dr. Lipsky, and he has to leave this afternoon, so we have to end here. Before we end, let me just make a couple of one announcement, and that is that on April 9th, the Hugh Patrick, Professor Hugh Patrick and the Professor Jerry Curtis, who are both of them the very distinguished professors at the Columbia University, but they are Japan experts. And actually, Jerry Curtis has been living in Tokyo many years, and Hugh Patrick is running the Japan the Economic Research Center at the Columbia University. Both of them will come on the April 9th, and they will talk about Japanese politics and economy, and which Dr. Lipsky alluded to this morning. And then April 12th, we have the Michael Fuchs, who is second man in German Parliament second man in CDU under the Chancellor Merkel. The Mr. Fuchs is actually he started as a businessman, as what is called hidden champion. He's a very successful businessman turned politician, and he became number 2 man in the German the parliament, and he will be coming to our institute, and he will make a special address on German hidden champions, and I'm sure our government policymakers will be very much interested in his, and so please make note of it. And that's April 2nd. Actually, we'll have a half-day seminar, and he will come with the German, the expert on hidden champions as well. Well, with this, we'll have to end, and we really appreciate very much, and Dr. Lipsky's visit with us. Actually, he came to Tokyo, and he made a special effort to come to Seoul to have this opportunity. Okay, please join me in thanking him. And thank you very much. Thank you.